I want to ask you just on floods, Holly. I can't help but feel this is the fourth flood event in that part of Sydney this year. There's got to be some movement on surely raising the walls of Warragamba Dam, doing something significantly about changing the planning rules to take people away from the lowest lying areas. We've got to move on this.
Look, absolutely, and I think raising the wall at Warragamba is something that needs to probably be looked at sooner rather than later. But when you look around New South Wales, it's not just Sydney. I mean, Sydney and Western Sydney is having a really tough time of it at the moment. But there's so many areas across New South Wales that have seen so much water, and of course in Queensland as well. We're not capturing this water, and we should be. You know, who listens to Tim Flannery? I mean, the guy's proved himself to be ridiculous. Apparently it was never raining again. He should pop his head outside. But, you know, we need to capture this water. We can do so much better, particularly in up our areas around agriculture where we can irrigate if we need to, that we can actually ensure there are drinking supplies. I can tell you there's plenty of people that have been out in rural and regional areas that have moved on to tank water because there is no town water. So we need to look at dams, we need to build more dams, and we need to get onto it ASAP, not stand around twiddling our thumbs and you know, opposing them for the most ridiculous reasons, because some, you know, frog or spotted owl or something might have to move.
It's always the most typical of cases. And the rain does fall, despite what Tim Flannery says to us. The rain does fall. We've just got to capture it at the time it falls so we can use it when it decides not to fall. Michael Danby, the head of the United Nations nuclear watchdog, will visit Australia this week as the agency prepares to scrutinise our AUKUS plan to build nuclear-powered submarines. Gee, I tell you what, Michael, they're quick on the draw. Talk about jumping the gun. These are at least a decade away.
Yeah, well, I think the issue of getting them is actually more important than sort of satisfying some bureaucrat at the United Nations. By the way, Chris, your editorials were both very funny, and commiserations, Holly, for being bagged by the insiders. You must be doing well if you're attacked by them. So,
don't leave that point, Michael. The main point we're about to show our viewers exactly what you're referring to because it was extremely funny. And we'll get to that in just a second, but go on.
But the Chinese have launched the third carrier. They're about to do 3 more very quickly. Their Navy is larger than the American Navy and the Indian Navy put together in the Pacific. They're moving on the South Pacific Forum in a few days' time, where they're going to turn up and hold their own conference on top of the South Pacific Island states without invitation. So we're in a serious situation, less attention to the United Nations. I think both the opposition and the government should go to the Americans and say, can we lease one of these Virginia-class nuclear submarines as soon as possible, even if we have to have a 50% US crew so that the Australian submariners can learn to operate a nuclear submarine.
Holly, I wouldn't disagree with any of that. But the point about the United Nations coming down and sticking their nose into this and saying, oh, it's against all anti-proliferation legislation. Sorry, this is about the protection of our nation. It's not about a civil nuclear industry.
Well, we would actually be the only ones without a nuclear weapon program with nuclear submarines. So their whole point about uranium and nuclear being misplaced or misused and redirected to a weapons program, we don't have anyway. But at a time when China is increasing its nuclear capacity, not in its nuclear submarines, but also in their ability to launch nuclear weapons, you've got to wonder who's pushing these agendas and whose bidding they're doing, because I don't think they're looking at the members of AUKUS or NATO, for that matter, and thinking we're on their side.
Yeah, exactly. The point about what it's all about could have been ascertained from any read of any newspaper based on the AUKUS agreement over submarines. They don't need to come here and stick their nose in it. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and French President Emmanuel Macron have put the costly submarine saga behind them when the two leaders met at the Elysee Palace in Paris. The pair also discussed Russia's war in Ukraine and tackling climate change. Michael, it's a relationship worth resetting, but I wonder whether we could trust the French to support us if war developed in the Indo-Pacific, do you think? Because after all, the French do have atolls and areas of sovereignty in this region. Like
the Brits, Chris, the French have had one of their aircraft carriers in the South China Sea over the last year. So that's a good development. They've got a lot of money and influence, and we should use a bucket of their money to influence, I wouldn't say bribe, the South Pacific states. A lot of that money now comes from us, oddly enough, and let's join them to the common influence. These are serious times for serious people. Australia has to be much more serious about international affairs. Amazing to see our friends at the ABC, the Drum and the Insiders, all they talk about is climate change, global warming. We could do with a bit of global warming down here in freezing Melbourne, I can tell you that.
Correct. Some people in Western Sydney would be saying the same thing, concurring with that as well. Now, this is where we get to what Michael Danby raised. This is a classic. The New South Wales Liberal Senator sitting next to me gave a speech to the Sydney Institute identifying, rightly, why the Morrison government was defeated in the recent election, and in doing so she suggested that many young voters have been influenced by an education system basically run by Marxists. Now, the insiders on the ABC, they did a great production job on this. They had this spin on Holly's speech.
We've got an education system that's basically run by Marxists. And so when kids are at school and they're being taught all this absolute left-wing rubbish, that's where they're leaving school and that's where they're landing. And they just don't have any comprehension of the impact of what they want to talk about.
That poster charts everyone's performance. We get stars when we master the material covered in class.
I think the left wing is across a lot of what we see through the school system nowadays. We know that it's all John Keynes, if not Marxism.
Who?
We're seeing as an almost woke agenda being put onto all sorts of curriculum now.
What about math?
We're not interested in experimental education here.
Now, I was watching The Outsiders. I wasn't watching The Insiders. I had to get that after all of that. What a classic that is.
It was rather entertaining. I didn't watch it either. When I found out it was Pat Carvelis and the new Senator Pocock being on the show, not that I normally watch Insiders anyway, I think it lost its way a while ago, but I was determined that I wasn't watching it this morning. And then to check my phone out at one point, there was quite the barrage of messages. But as someone said, when they're parodying you that way, well, clearly you've made it. But I was really actually quite grateful for it, because the point that we were trying to make, I think, is very, very true. We do have an education system. And again, just for those that want to keep their knickers on, I'm not talking about every individual teacher out there.
Of course not.
I'm talking about the curriculum. I'm talking a way the universities have now adopted more a Paulo Freire way of looking at things. They've taken away the ability for people that are learning to be teachers to actually have inquisitive minds, to actually learn how to ask questions and examine things and have a love of learning and wanting to know more, seeking truth and wisdom. Those sort of things have gone out the door now. It's all about this sort of Marxist agenda, which is exactly what Paulo Freire is, which is what they're trying to adopt through the curriculum and the associations. I'm not a big one. You might be able to help me out, Michael.
Michael
Unions
Danby,
pushing that.
Let's marry the two subjects. The one you raised about the infatuation with climate change, both on the ABC, as you rightly pointed out, and also in the classroom, but not telling the full scientific truth about what we can reasonably achieve if we stop CO2 emissions in Australia, and what Holly had to say. There is a marriage, there is a link between the two, isn't there?
There are many great teachers, as Holly said, but the debate about woke culture in the universities, schools, in bureaucracies is a legitimate topic for debate. Of course, if you watched The Insiders this morning, there was no other view. The Germans have a word for that program this morning. They call it a Wolkenkuckucksheim, cloud cuckoo land. The debate in Australia about climate change exists as if nothing is happening in the rest of the world. Yeah. The German Greens are more realistic than those people that were on that program this morning. And of course, in Germany, they're talking about, they're serious people. The Russians are switching off their gas, so they're going to have to talk about switching back on coal plants and back on nuclear plants. And the German Greens are leading that debate. I wish wish Patricia Cavellis would have Holly Hughes and the German Greens debate that on her program next time. Of course she won't, because what they do is they exclude people who have different views. Now, my views are different than Holly's. My views are probably different than yours as Chris's. But if you only have 4 people who have all the same views on this, you'll never educate the Australian people as to what the alternatives are. And what I'm telling you is, I'm a Labor man and I'm with Joel Fitzgibbon, and I don't believe pensioners or poor people should have to pay high electricity prices because of the fantasies of some people in Point Piper and Brighton about global warming.
But they will. But they will.
Well, you know, and I miss Joel, Michael. I never got to serve with you, but Joel's, in fact, I was messaging with him only just this weekend, but he was, I think, unfortunately for the Labor Party, the last voice of reason when it came to this, because they are absolutely beholden to a left-wing climate change obsessed agenda, and anyone who raises any questions about how are we going to pay for it, you are somehow a climate change denier.
Yeah, denier. You're not... There is a subtle difference between all of these arguments. The subtlety is that you do not become a denier simply because you're asking questions about what you will achieve by spending billions of dollars. You are not a denier for the sake of arguing that point. But just finally, Michael Danby, the New South Wales government is planning to give Aboriginal landowners greater control over the management of national parks. Environment Minister James Griffin says the new model could result in the returning of native title for all New South Wales national parks over a 15 to 20-year period. This is one of those proposals that has to be about creating Indigenous business and jobs, which we're seeing in pockets of Australia, Michael. But it can't be just about, here's your title deeds for the national park, put it up in a frame and enjoy it. You've got to actually be productive and constructive with local Aboriginal communities, don't you?
Well, I'm with the Pearson Mundine Price Indigenous School here, who argue that native title must be married to land use and Indigenous people having the ability to get economic performance out of these estates,
Yes.
which will be basically gifted to them. So that there's a constructive way. I mean, can you imagine a better way of going around Kakadu National Park than being led by an Indigenous leader who knows his own territory, etc.? It's a tourism industry. It's an entirely legitimate way of pursuing our Indigenous people's economic and well-being and their interests. So it's that's a good development as far as I'm concerned, particularly if they go the employment path.
Well said. Good to have you on the program, Michael. All the best for the week ahead. Holly Hughes, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Chris.
Well, it's freezing down here.
You pick where you live. Thank you for that. Senator Holly Hughes and Michael Danby.